Early Greek philosophers. Aristotle. History of Psychology. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Aristotle is the last of our big three Greek philosophers and represents the pinnacle of Greek philosophical thought. I find his work very interesting and fascinating. He's the last individual that some scholars say that was able to know everything that was knowable in his lifetime. Now, with the knowledge explosion, that's really impossible, but that one really blows my mind. Imagine being able to have a grasp on everything that's knowable. I can barely keep track of the journals in my subspecialty areas in psychology, nevertheless all of psychology or all of nature. So let's spend some time talking about Aristotle. He traveled around to Greece. He spent some time in Macedonia and tutored Alexander the Great. He had a major influence on Alexander the Great's thinking. He also tutored Alexander's brother, Fred the Pretty Good, but that didn't work out quite as well. In Athens, he founded the Lyceum. The Lyceum is the first university. It was the first center of knowledge. Lyceum is a Greek word that means porch. So there weren't buildings and classrooms and things like that. It was a long porch where older philosophers taught younger philosophers. And it was quite informal. Had to have been extremely fascinating. Well, before we talk specifically about Aristotle's work, let's spend some time contrasting Aristotle with Plato. So let's look at this. I said, let's look at this. Okay. Sometimes we just got to give the slides a boost. Okay, Plato versus Aristotle. Plato believed reality was in the forms, independent of nature. Aristotle believed that abstract principles could only be known by studying nature. The principles that Plato arrived at were due to pure thought. For Aristotle, all of his principles were derived from observing nature directly. Plato, again with his abstract world of pure forms, all knowledge is independent of nature. For Aristotle, the only way to learn things is to study nature. Kind of getting the idea here. And a couple more points. For Plato, the body is a hindrance in studying the forms. Remember, the body gets in the way of things in Platonic philosophy. For Aristotle, the body is how you study forms, or the forms, he would say, that were nature. And finally, the one that all psychology majors love most about Aristotle, that for Plato, mathematics were key to understanding the world because they represented that permanent knowable thing. For Aristotle, mathematics was useless in the observation of nature, which is something that many students of psychology tell us when they have to take methods in stat. But despite that Aristotle says that math was useless, you still need to know your stats to be a good psychologist. Okay, well, one thing Let's talk about Aristotle and causation. For Aristotle, there are four components to causation, or the reason something exists. And Aristotle believed everything had a reason for existing. So there are four causes. The first cause is the material cause. The material cause is the matter of an object, what it's made out of. Now, I'm going to use the example for causation of sculpting a statue. So naturally, the material cause for a statue is the substance that it's made out of. Here's a block of marble. Let's use this example. Make it a chip off the old block. So Aristotle talks next about formal causation. Now, just because he rejected some of Plato's and Socrates' ideas doesn't mean he totally rejected them. And the formal cause is the end result, the form, if you would, in a Platonic sense, the shape of something, not necessarily its immortal, permanent form, but its form. And in this case, we have a picture of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, which has been sculpted. We also have the efficient cause. Now, the efficient cause is the force that transforms matter into the form. In other words, the energy of the sculptor chipping away the stone to reveal the final product. I've talked with some artists and some sculptors, and a couple of them have told me that they see the statue inside the block of marble, and their job is to simply remove that marble from the statue, the extra stuff. Aristotle believed everything exists for a reason and function in nature. And he called the projection of things through their existence teleology. And it's a major component of his theory. Let me get my slides organized and my pointer here. You'll find, especially if you take my personality class, that Carl Jung also talks about the idea of teleology. And Jung says a person lives by their aims and their causes. He modifies the Aristotle idea and says that we live not only by what's happened to us in the past and what's happening to us in the present, but what we think the future is going to be for us. That's a different lecture, a different topic, but same idea. So with Aristotle, everything exists for a reason. And that's everything in the cosmos. We're back to humans' place in the cosmos again in our intellectual ping pong game of studying philosophy. One other term you need to know about teleology in Aristotle's terms is entalpy. And entalpy is the energy or force that propels an object in its direction. In other words, to its purpose. That'll become more apparent in a couple of minutes. Now, Aristotle believed that nature also had a grand design. And everything in nature is at a fixed level. He called this the scala natya. The lowest matter in the scala natya is inert matter, neutral matter. Dirt, rocks, part of the scala nacha. At the other end of the scala nacha, you have an abstract concept that Aristotle developed that's a little bit fuzzy. So hang on for the explanation and listen carefully. The highest level in scala nacha is the unmoved mover. Now, the unmoved mover is a logical necessity of Aristotle's system. If you look at modern physics and the Big Bang Theory, very similar. What made the Big Bang happen? And Aristotle said everything started as a point also in nature, and something started it moving on its path and moving out the cosmos. Now, as a simple logical necessity, you need something to start the Big Bang. And this, in Aristotle's scheme, is an entity called the unmoved mover. The unmoved mover was always there, will always be there, and the only purpose the unmoved mover has is starting the motion of the cosmos. Now, as we see philosophical ideas being planted into early Christian religious views, and those would include some of the Hebrew views as well, you find that the unmoved mover gets turned into God. Now, Judaism was around a long time before Aristotle, but it still gets to be one of those co-opted things. But, and here's a critical point on unmoved mover, God said, not God, excuse me, I really misspoke there. My dyslexia is acting up. I'm sorry. The unmoved mover, Aristotle said, is simply a logical necessity, as I was about to say before I tied my tongue, not God. Unmoved mover gets turned into God later, but not an Aristotle thing. Below God, humans. And then take the animals down in order from complex to simple. And you have scala nacha. Now, within the scala nacha, there's a hierarchy of souls. There are 3 levels. Each of the succeeding levels also subsumes all of the characteristics of the previous level. So the first level is the vegetative level. And plants have vegetative souls. According to Aristotle, plants are very simple entities. They grow, they assimilate food, they reproduce. Now, even up to the 1800s, people will counter that. Erasmus Darwin, for those of you that aren't on a first-name basis with him, Charles Darwin's grandfather believed that certain plants had brains, like the Venus flytrap type plant. He was wrong, but Aristotle's stuff didn't stick. Other people came in with other views later. Now, the second level of the soul in Aristotle's scheme is the sensitive soul. Now, animals have sensitive souls, but not plants. So, animals can sense and respond to environmental cues. They experience pleasure and pain. And they also have memories. So they have these simple psychological characteristics. I'm looking over, and to the left of my camera, Pippin, the dog that you see at the end of every video, is sleeping on my couch in the office. Pippin's got it pretty good. He comes in, he goes immediately to the kitchen so he can get fed. He senses pleasure when he gets the food he wants. Occasionally he feels pain. He's getting about 15 years old, and he's creaking a little bit, so I know he might have a little bit of arthritis and things like that. And he's got a memory. He knows where I keep certain things that affect him, like his leash for walks, like his food and his treats and things like that. And he also has a pretty good memory for remembering when he's supposed to be fed, when he's supposed to get treats and stuff like that. So the next level of soul, sensitive soul. Animals, but not plants, but these sensitive souls also subsume all the characteristics of the vegetative soul. They assimilate food, they reproduce, and stuff like that. Now the highest level of soul, in Aristotle's view, is the rational soul. Humans have rational souls. The rational soul has two functions. It thinks and it has rational thought, which Aristotle thought was the most important thing about the rational soul, naturally as a philosopher. And he talked dismissively of individuals who only operated on a vegetative or a sensitive soul manner and didn't really think about what they did. In fact, we still call people that don't do a whole lot of stuff vegetables, couch potatoes, things like that to this day. Aristotle talked about a lot of things that are very psychology-ish. In fact, I would think, from my point of view, he's the most like a first psychologist. And in our book, you'll find that many people get dubbed the first psychologist. I think Aristotle is deserving of that title. Now, Aristotle talks about sensations. And a sensation is a feeling or a perception we get based on stimulation of the senses. Now, unlike Plato, Aristotle said we could trust our sensations and we can trust our senses. They give us good information. So Aristotle talks about the 5 basic senses: vision, smell, hearing, touch, taste. And then he also does something interesting. He integrates those into a broader sense that's called common sense. And common sense is basically an integration of the 5 senses. And you get a total feeling or total view of the senses that you're experiencing at any given time. The easiest example for that is to think about going to a restaurant. Last weekend, my wife and I went to one of my favorite Japanese restaurants, and I ordered something called a sharishi bowl, which is basically slices of different sashimi over seasoned rice. It's one of my favorite things to get at a Japanese sushi place, because you get a little bit of everything. And if you think about something like a sharishi bowl, for me, my mouth is starting to water just thinking about it. But the presentation at the restaurant I was at, which, if you're nosy, is Tamari in Fresno, they do just a marvelous job of serving food there. So my bowl came. All the fish was arranged very nicely. There were some vegetables in there for color. There was a little flour in there. And then naturally the wasabi and the ginger on the side. But it was very artfully displayed. And so when you see this and you look at it and your dinner looks extremely appetizing, you're going to want to eat it right away. And it did taste very good. The fish had nice texture. Everything from a nice mild piece of tuna to a little bit tougher to eat piece of octopus. Although I love my octopus. And you get the different sensations, the smell, the taste, the ambience of the restaurant. All of this gives you the broader view, the common sense perception of what's going on. I'm super busy right now, so dinner was from a bag. My wife came home with McDonald's, which I rarely eat, but I enjoy a good Big Mac once in a while. And so I ate my Big Mac and my fries. Haven't had fries in months, trying to be good. And it was good, but it was sitting watching Jeopardy with the paper bags sitting on my lap and a can of soda by my side. Not the same ambience as Tamari. So the common sense is your overall feeling of being in a certain place based on all of your sensory information at the same time. Cool idea. We'll see common sense come up again and again. Now, in terms of reason, Aristotle believed there were two forms of reason. First of all, there's that everyday reasoning that we have to do to get by during the day. And he called this passive reason. It's just your everyday understanding. I have to go to work. This is how I get to work. This is how I get home. This is what I'm going to do. You don't necessarily need to understand the deep lying essences of anything to get through the day. Active reasoning for Aristotle is the highest form of reasoning. It's what he believed was the ultimate goal for humans. It's what we were supposed to do in our level of the Scala Nacha. And the capacity to actively reason about things, Aristotle believes leads to happiness. So it's really one of the first theories of self-actualization, is being able to actively reason and use that information to make your life and the life of those around you better, or just to simply understand things. He believed it was the ontology, the direction, the goal of being human. So all of this fits in under the general rubric of teleology, the nature of where something's place is in the universe to what it's supposed to do there. Naturally, rocks and dirt have an ontology. They're there for us to stand on, to grow things on, to build things into. But they don't have the higher order functioning of living things, according to Aristotle. So, in terms of active reasoning and how it works, he believes that it's a metaphysical component of the soul. It's immortal. It lives beyond your lifetime. But when your immortal soul leaves the body, it has no recollection of the past life. It's pure thought, and we all have it. I always think in terms of pure thought of an old Star Trek episode from the 60s, where the aliens are really just pure balls of energy and manifest themselves as humans. So us rather lowly humans can understand them. Well, in terms of being one of the first psychologists, Aristotle also gives us some rules of memory and recall. And a lot of these are still rules of memory and recall that people use today to study these concepts. So Aristotle talks about remembering. We have the capacity to remember things. We have the capacity to also recall things, bring them back into thought. Now, he has 4 rules of association or memory, and you're going to see these pop up again and again as laws of association, laws of learning, things like that. The first is the law of contiguity. And contiguity basically states that we remember things based on what they were next to. So if I were to ask you where the letter Q is in the alphabet, most likely you'd have to do a run through of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and go through the whole thing. I have to. Maybe you're smarter than me. But we remember things like letters because we learn the alphabet as a sequence of 26 letters. So we tend to have to go through them contiguously to find the letter we're interested in discussing. Think about contiguity in terms of other kinds of stuff. The other day, I came in after doing some grocery shopping. It was bright. Had my sunglasses on. Went into the kitchen. Put the bags down. Took the sunglasses off. Left them on the kitchen counter instead of putting them in the hallway where I am supposed to, so I don't forget where I've left them. And commenced to put the groceries away because I had some frozen stuff and refrigerated stuff. So by the time I got the groceries away, I didn't get around to putting the sunglasses back. Next day rolls around. Where are my blinking sunglasses? So what did I do? I basically constructed what happened to me when I got home. So when was the last time I had my sunglasses? When I came in from grocery shopping. What did I do? I first took the bags, went into the kitchen, took the glasses off, set them on the counter, and put the groceries away. Relatively simple example. Fortunately, my sunglasses were on the counter, so that example worked for us. Second law of memory and association, frequency. And the second law of association is frequency. Yes, I said the second law of association is frequency. So you got the bad joke at this point, right? We remember things because we hear them often. I'm always amazed that I can recall the words of songs I listened to a whole lot in my youth. And I even remember things I don't want to remember. Hopefully this won't get too far into long-term memory. But right now there are a couple of commercials on television, and they're playing them like every 5 minutes on the morning shows. And at this point, I've got the commercials pretty memorized. Although I'm so tired of hearing them, I usually pick up the channel changer and flick to just anything else not to have to watch that commercial again. But we remember things that we experience just because we hear them a lot or see them a lot or experience them a lot. The last two laws we can handle as a pair because they're opposites. We remember something because it's similar to something else. So if I were to ask you to remember a certain professor you had, you might remember that professor after you think, oh, well, he was kind of like this professor, but not like that. That would be contrast. And then you can remember the person. So similarity, we remember things because they're similar to other things that we know. If you run into somebody who looks very much like one of your siblings, that happened to me the other day, you tend to remember their face better because you've already got a basis for that by having that image kind of already in your mind. Contrast, just the opposite. We remember something because it's different than something else. So you might get some polar opposites. You might say, well, I remember this piece of food I ate, and it really wasn't like what I expected it to be. And then you get a contrast going. So these are 4 useful memory rules, and you'll see them come up again and again in the history of psychology, and probably in a class like that has to do with the learning about memory and stuff like that. Aristotle also talks about important things like motivation. And Aristotle believes that our behavior is directed towards the satisfaction of our appetites. Now, in our modern parlance, we use appetite to simply describe being hungry or having a taste for something or something like that. Aristotle, different view. Aristotle says that when our appetites are aroused, we experience discomfort. And our behavior in turn becomes stimulated to eliminate that discomfort. If we're successful in reducing the discomfort, we feel good. Now, rational thought can overcome the appetites. Now, the appetites can be generally any of the biological motivating things that we still talk about today. So hunger, naturally, thirst, sex, thermal regulation, thirst, those types of things. And since we're using food examples, because they're safer than sex examples, let's run through an example with food. So you haven't eaten for a while. You start getting a feeling that your blood sugar is running low. You feel a little squeamish. Your tummy's rumbling maybe. And all of those are cues to eliminate the discomfort you felt by not being satiated, by not having food. So you go find something to eat, put everything back in a normal state of affairs, and it feels good. We feel good after a good meal. Now we have to watch our appetites, because if we overdo it, we might create a new problem. So if you want to think back to a recent Thanksgiving where maybe you overate and went from being satiated to having some kind of physical discomfort, well, taking care of one appetite created a new problem in your system. And Aristotle believes the most important thing that you can do is try to stay on an even keel, to be moderate. And this staying on an even keel where you're never too uncomfortable with something becomes one of the first theories of homeostasis. Happiness is our last Aristotelian topic. I think we all want to be happy. And what does Aristotle have to say about happiness? He says happiness comes from doing what we naturally do, what fits in with our nature. He says the best life is lived in moderation. This was not only an Aristotle thing, it was kind of a Greek thing. And Aristotle believed, like many other Greeks did, that the ability to exert self-control is important. And you should live within something he calls the golden mean, where you're never too far out of whack with homeostasis. You're never too hungry, too thirsty, too wanting sex, or should we say horny, the colloquial word? Gives me memories of the old Austin Power movies. But you should never be too satiated or too unsatiated. You should live with this mean. Now, Aristotle's work represents the pinnacle of the age of the great Greek philosophers. We'll talk about many that follow, but we've now finished with the big three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Our next set of philosophers are going to represent what happens when Roman rule takes over and changes how people live. We'll see you next time in the history of psychology. This has been a We Have Couches video production, copyright 2020, Professor Michael D. Botwin, all rights reserved. You better believe it.